Okay, well, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sprague, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for the National Trust. And I will be moderating today's webinar, which we've titled Affordable Housing and Historic Preservation, Opportunities for 2024. So a very important subject, and we are very excited to have a great panel for you today. A few housekeeping items first. Preservation Leadership Forum is the professional membership program of the National Trust, and this webinar series is made possible by the members of Preservation Leadership Forum, so we're grateful for all the members that are on and with us today. So for today's webinar, we will be taking an in-depth look at the intersection of historic preservation and federal housing policy, and be looking at how these different but interrelated priorities can work together to help solve the affordable housing crisis facing the nation, and what opportunities and challenges lie ahead for 2024. We again have a great program for you today, and a few more webinar logistics for you. Our panelists will first present on their respective topic areas, and then we'll dedicate the last portion of the webinar to discussion. So you should feel free to send questions to the group via the Q&A function, but we will unlikely get to your questions, but we do intend to do our best to capture your questions, and we'll encourage our panelists to answer during the webinar. But for those questions we can't get to, we will follow up either in a communication to you or in a blog post or some other communication following the webinar. But you are all nonetheless encouraged to communicate to all participants via the chat function. A couple other items: the closed captioning function is enabled for this webinar, and following the program, we will send out a recording of the webinar directly to the email that you use to register. And finally, all forum webinars are available on our National Trust YouTube channel, so please be sure to check that out. So with that, I wanted to open our conversation with a few thoughts to contextualize the affordable housing crisis and the important role historic preservation will play in helping solve this problem. First, older and historic buildings have an important role to play in helping shape the policies designed to increase housing affordability and expanding the supply of market rate housing. The enormity of the problem calls for an all-of-the-above approach to affordable housing creation and retention. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there is an overall housing shortage of 7.3 million units in the nation. So new construction alone is simply not keeping pace with the demand for affordable housing. Too often, historic preservation requirements are viewed as a barrier to increasing supply of both market rate and affordable housing, but underutilized older and historic buildings represent a vitally important opportunity for rehabilitation and adaptive reuse for housing of all types. But how might the historic preservation movement help change the narrative in 2024? The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation recently updated its housing policy guidance, suggesting ways for historic preservation can better support housing creation. We're looking forward to hearing more from Advisory Council Chair Sara Bronin on the updated policy and what we might expect in the months to come. Next, historic districts play an important role in preserving architectural fabric, historic buildings, and community character. Preservation and planning work hand in hand to ensure the conservation of housing stock, and while at the same time promoting economic revitalization. As calls resonate for zoning reform and ways land use controls might evolve to accommodate more housing, what best practices exist for harmonizing these historic preservation and housing objectives? We're very pleased to have Jason Jordan with us today with the American Planning Association. Jason is APA's Political Affairs Director, and he is responsible for strategic outreach to decision makers and influencers who interact with the planning profession. The APA is at the center of the housing policy debate and has developed robust guidance on preserving historic and cultural resources, Thank you for being here, Jason. And finally, since the start of the pandemic, we have witnessed a dramatic shift away from our downtowns, abandoning once highly valued office space. Converting office space to multi-use and residential uses puts adaptive reuse solutions at the center of the housing debate. And this is good news for the preservation community. We find ourselves at a moment when adaptive reuse is being talked about by new audiences as part of the solution. In fact, as noted by the American Institute of Architects, for the first time in 20 years, renovations have overtaken new construction in architectural buildings in the United States. This is the language of preservation and a key moment for the preservation community to demonstrate just how valuable a tool adaptive reuse is and how it can be done well. But how well will office conversions perform in meeting this housing need? With us today, Allison Toonen-Talamo, an engineer by training and an associate with Klein and Hoffman in Chicago. Allison and the team at Klein and Hoffman have helped convert YMCA buildings into affordable housing, rehabilitated properties that have historically provided affordable housing, and converted office buildings into housing. So thank you for joining us today, Allie. So with that, we wanted to turn it over to our first presenter, Chair Bronin. So Sara, without further ado, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for providing that really compelling introduction to this issue and why we are all here today. So as Shaw said, I'm Sara Bronin. I'm the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And first I wanted to talk about just what is that? Next slide. I'd love to introduce you to our members. You already know one of them very well, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But the council is an independent federal agency with 24 members. And it's those members that come together to vote on important policies like the one I'm going to talk about today, and that set out the way that we will perform our other responsibilities that were designated to us under the National Historic Preservation Act. The members include 9 federal agencies and the architect of the Capitol, 8 presidential appointees, of which I am one, and I guess I'm the only full-time member of the council, a governor, mayor, a tribal member, and then the National Trust, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. And I give you this laundry list to tell you that when the Advisory Council does adopt a policy statement, it represents a broad spectrum of views in preservation, including what you might consider official views like the federal agencies and the SHPOs, and appointees and experts and public members are included among those, as well as elected officials. And usually our tribal member is also an elected official, like our current one, Chairman Reno Franklin is for his tribe. And NAFPO too, playing a role in the federal historic preservation framework alongside the state historic preservation officers. So you get this array of views, which really helps to inform our discussions. And on our next slide, we'll see the 2 functions of the Advisory Council, as I like to point out. The first one is probably the one, if you've heard of the Advisory Council, you know best, which is our oversight of the Section 106 review process. And this is a provision of the National Historic Preservation Act that triggers a review of federal agency undertakings to see whether these federal agency actions are have impacts on historic resources. So just flag that brief overview of 106, because I'll mention it in a moment. But that, I would say, is the bulk of what the agency does. The bulk of the staff is devoted to 106 reviews and really managing that process and administering it as we've laid it out in our own regulations. But the second function in very general terms of the Advisory Council is in fact embedded in its name, and that is advice. So we were made by statute to advise the President, Congress, and state and local governments on preservation policy. Just today, I submitted a report to the White House, a triennial report on federal stewardship of historic properties. So we certainly take that seriously. In today's discussion about our housing policy statement, I wanted to first explain why we decided to update that statement. There was one from 2006, so I guess you could say we are revising now in 2023 when it was passed. But that policy statement was, in a way, limited in scope. If any of you were familiar with it or participated in the development of it, it was primarily limited to the way federal agencies should treat housing in that Section 106 review process that I mentioned. And its scope was limited to affordable housing. Now, Shaw described in his introductory comments the need for us to consider everything, do it all approach, trying to promote the supply of housing that includes market rate housing, that includes affordable housing. As he said, existing buildings, historic buildings can help address this crisis. It's sometimes seen as a barrier to housing. And I do think that as the Federal Historic Preservation Agency tasked with helping to set the stage for the federal government and our state and local partners on preservation policy, we really had a responsibility to update that policy statement and really get to the very best practices that we could embed in it and demonstrate leadership in that regard. So in the policy statement itself, there are 13 principles, and I'm going to cover a few of them today that I think are maybe most relevant, but this provides you with an overview of the topics that are covered. And first and foremost, the historic tax credit, a topic that has been the subject of previous National Trust forums, preservation leadership forums, and many of you have been involved in tax credit projects. The need for us to continue to support that program and expand it among states is critically important. Other principles talk about reuse and maintenance, building codes, accessibility, energy retrofitting, outleasing of public buildings, flexible federal guidance, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, and research, education, and collaboration. So that's the overview. I'm going to dig into a couple of these a little bit more. One of the, I guess you would say, big categories of principles that we embedded in this policy statement, which is about 10 pages long. It's not an extremely lengthy document. But the overview provided in that document with all of these principles is really for us to say, as a federal government, as our partners that are involved in the advisory council, and for state and local officials, we should embrace these principles. So the first one, as I said, expand historic tax incentives for housing. That goes both the state level that I mentioned, but also expanding historic tax credits to ensure they can be paired with low-income housing tax credits and renewable energy tax credits. These really technical tax rules are in many ways key to our ability as preservationists to address some of the bigger issues that we are called on and are really obligated to address. So, some of our eyes may glaze over in reading through those details, but the big picture has to be we've got to keep expanding that program. Weatherization and renewable energy funding, again, just like preservation can play a big role in housing, we also have to think about the extent to which through housing rehabs, we can play a big role in addressing the climate crisis. So supporting funding for that is embedded in this policy statement. We also recognize that there are other, I would say, enduring and potentially age-related concerns associated with historic buildings that tend to make them less suitable for housing in certain circumstances. So hazard mitigation is something that's addressed in the policy statement, whether that's lead, asbestos, mold, or other environmental health hazards. We need, as preservationists, need to promote the resolution and mitigation of those hazards, even if it means losing some historic fabric, balancing that with the need to protect human health is something that we prioritize in the statement. In the next grouping, I would call it zoning, building, and the ADA. The policy statement really talks about tackling the questions that I know Jason Jordan will be discussing next on zoning. The policy statement calls explicitly for the kind of density that we used to have in many historic neighborhoods. So this is not this is an old idea that got edited out through zoning and other rules that mostly happen at the local level, but that as preservationists, we should fight to bring back in order to ensure that our historic neighborhoods have the density they once had. That includes things like accessory dwellings. It includes things like making sure we can fill those vacant lots that in many historic places have sat empty for too long. Office commercial conversions and multifamily housing as well. Preservation standards that we apply with building codes and accessibility requirements, both of those, all three of those regulations need to start working together a little bit more effectively. And we talk about some of the priorities that preservationists can set in the policy statement. Thinking about our review process, and this is where we get back into that section 106 concept on the next slide. We really do need at the federal level to update our processes for projects affecting housing, historic buildings that already are housing, and conversions to housing. And so thinking about ways to more flexibly and creatively address impacts to historic properties, and effects to character defining features that again is explicitly stated in the policy statement as a goal, and one in fact that the advisory council can bring to fruition. So moving on to implementation, and here's Liberty Tower in New York City. If we go to the next slide, thinking about our agency's ability to carry forward some of the ideas in the policy statement, we've already started implementing it, even though it was just past December. In December, we're going full steam ahead thanks to our excellent staff, and we're developing new guidance on housing, including articulating how adverse effects, which is that thing that federal agencies want to avoid, should be considered under 106, how certain activities can or cannot be considered adverse effects on historic buildings when it comes to housing. And we're also considering a government-wide, what's called a program alternative, a flexibility tool for housing. On the next slide, kind of embedded in that process, we have been reviewing federal public comments, many of which you submitted, I bet, on the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, not to call out any one body, certainly not the Park Service, not local commissions, not state historic preservation officers, but to reflect collectively on how the application and interpretation of those standards is actually done in the field. That should say publishing suggestions. I was maybe over optimistic. I think they'll come out on Tuesday. So slight edit to the slide. But I do think that the report that I will be issuing to the council might help, again, for all of us as preservationists to reflect on the extent to which strict interpretations of the standards at all levels, not calling any one entity out, might be something that we as preservationists need to reflect on and work to change to the extent that that strictness isn't necessary. And then finally, just looking at state and local advising. I just went to Charleston next week. I love that visit. So if any of you guys are out there calling in from Charleston, you're so lucky. But they had asked me to come in and talk about actually the housing policy and our climate policy and what at the local level might be embedded into local rules. We are doing more of that to understand how you, as a representative of a state or local government or a state or local entity, a nonprofit, might be able to request our our advice on draft legislation that might implicate historic properties, please visit that website and check out the ways in which ACHP might be involved. We did just submit a letter to the Florida legislature on a proposed bill that would negatively impact coastal properties, and explaining how within the broad constellation of things we know about preservation and the federal preservation framework, such a bill might be in need of amendment. So check that out. I welcome your input. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my friend at the APA, Jason Jordan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always great to share a program with you, and applaud all the great work that you're doing at the council. Thank you, Shaw. Thank you to the Trust for inviting me and the APA to participate in this important discussion. This is a topic very much on our minds, as housing and zoning reform have become a critical priority for not only APA, but the planning movement across the country. And there's a great moment of opportunity and intersection with the preservation community. So if we could go to the next slide, let me just say a quick word to sort of set the context here. I know this is something that seems obvious to probably everyone on this call, but it's worth sort of calling out at the outset that the nation confronts a housing crisis that is in part a crisis of supply. And for a lot of people working in housing, I think historically we focused a lot on the demand side of tackling the housing crisis, and that's appropriate. Those subsidies are critical, and certainly APA supports them. At the same time, I think we've come to appreciate that part of the problem is very much on the supply side of the equation. And that's where a lot of the regulatory structures that my members are partly responsible for come into play. We also know through research that we've supported through the Up for Growth Coalition that the problem of undersupply in the country is increasing. It's getting worse year over year, but it's also spreading. So a problem that was largely focused on large coastal communities a few years ago is now actually increasing most rapidly in exurban areas and in rural areas. And certainly the trends coming out of the pandemic of work from home have only accelerated that. And what we're seeing is that this conversation about how do we tackle housing supply is now driving the political agenda in lots of places at all levels of government. So we see it turn up at the local level, we see it increasingly at the state level, and even here in Washington, where I am. As part of our approach to tackling housing supply, we felt it was important to start with some definitional work. So when we think of supply, we're really focusing on diverse housing types. So creating new options for people across the spectrum, making sure that housing is attainable and affordable. Again, not just capital A affordable housing, although that's critically important, but thinking about housing affordability writ large. And then, of course, no conversation about zoning and the land use rules in this country can ignore the fact that there's an equity conversation that's part of this as well, given the history of zoning in particular. If we go to the next slide, I think it's worth sort of talking about why zoning reform has become such a major policy concern really at the center of this housing affordability crisis and the undersupply problem, because there's a lot of ways you could tackle undersupply and a lot of ways you can tackle housing. But this focus on zoning and codes and regulations, I don't think is accidental. So when you think about the drivers here of the problem, some of them are clearly related to labor, whether that's about productivity or the supply of labor, the cost. It could be about the materials themselves, the so-called lumber challenges, the cost of materials, supply chain disruptions. That's clearly part of the problem. And then, of course, the land itself. Housing has to be built on something. And there are obviously market and political constraints associated with that, but there are also the regulatory structure of zoning and codes. Now, if you're a politician or an elected official or someone trying to solve this problem by pulling a policy lever, I think when you look at those opportunities, it becomes clear that the lowest hanging fruit really is to tackle the things that you have direct control of and where a change now can make a near-term difference. And that's why I think the conversation about zoning reform has moved forward as rapidly as it has. And on the next slide, sort of demonstrate the widespread nature of this activity, focusing on the states. So in just the last 3 years, a dozen states across the country have taken major actions. An even larger number have taken smaller actions, but the states that you see highlighted there either passed major zoning reform legislation or the governor put forward an executive order. So that's a significant amount of activity in a short period of time. But fast forward just to the first month and a half of 2024, we already see many of those same states coming back for a second bite at the apple of reform, and a much larger growing number of states who are actively debating changes right now. So we are certainly anticipating that the ranks of states taking state-level action on zoning reform will increase this year. And we're probably on the early side of the trend line, with more states likely to take action in the years to come. If you go to the next slide, we'll focus a little bit on what exactly that action looks like. And it's different, of course, in lots of different places. So in some places, we're seeing a menu of reform options that locals can avail themselves of. And if they select a certain number of those reforms and implement those, then they qualify for various incentives, whether that's an upfront incentive to do better planning, or whether it's a backside incentive on the capital side to support housing development, or in some cases, the infrastructure related to supporting housing development. We are seeing a number of states moving to preempt local authority over certain aspects of land use controls. We're seeing states who are looking at the underlying planning statutes themselves. What are communities enabled to do under state law, or setting policy goals and then allowing more local control as it relates to achieving those goals and objectives. Some places are focusing on technical assistance. In other places, many of those other reforms are being combined with state set targets for production and affordability, with back-end enforcement mechanisms. We're beginning to see this more on the West Coast, of so-called builder's remedy opportunities that are essentially enforcement mechanisms. We're also seeing environmental review reform, because unfortunately, the environmental review process in some places is sort of being weaponized, if you will, against housing development in ways that probably aren't consistent with the underlying intent of those laws. And then lastly, emphasis on workforce housing and infrastructure development have a major housing component. So we're seeing many states take action in concert there. So that's just a look at some of the broad actions that the states are doing. On the next slide, we'll take a little bit closer look at what's happening when you get to that local level. Because even when you have states that are taking major actions, at the end of the day, those mandates flow down to localities who have to handle the implementation. And this is just sort of our thinking about what locally led reform typically looks like. First, no surprise probably coming from the APA, but you lead with planning that identifies your core assets and sets in place the objectives that you're trying to meet and how you want to go about meeting them. Our view is that one of the most important aspects of overall reform is having the controversies at the right part of the process, up front as part of the planning discussion, as opposed to the project by project way that it often unfolds now. So leading with the planning process. As it relates to the regulatory side, once you have that plan in place, once there's a community vision established, we need to do a better job of simplifying and consolidating things like zoning districts and the very sort of large layers of complexity that have found their way into many codes. Thirdly, you add flexibility. So if we simplify our codes, then we create more flexibility within the standards and within the constructs of the plan itself. Local government can do a lot to speed its own processes so that we're moving things faster. In our conversations with developers, this is the most important thing for them in many instances from the financial perspective, is making the process predictable and as fast as possible. And then lastly, avoid excess discretionary reviews and try to move that more into a ministerial review process based on standards that everybody knows and understands. So that's kind of the general ecosystem, if you will, of what many of the individual local-led solutions look like. On the next slide, I'll just give you a sense of what we're seeing individual communities do in this space, some of which directly relates to the role of preservation and affordable housing and housing development. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just wanted to give you an overall sense of the universe here. At the sort of low-hanging fruit end of the spectrum, we're seeing a growing number of communities eliminate parking minimums. We're seeing a lot of work on accessory dwelling unit reform, and not just permitting them, but actually changing some of the structures to facilitate their development. A big focus on that density that Sara talked about in terms of legalizing various missing middle housing typologies. Moving back toward by right multifamily housing development, especially in areas that it makes the most sense, commercial districts and transit. There's a lot of stuff happening around building codes, particularly some on the single stair design side of things. I mentioned the permitting and streamlining of review processes. Commercial conversions and adaptive reuse are also very big topics at the moment for all the reasons that Shaw articulated at the outset. So we're seeing a lot of work in that space. We're also seeing the use of overlay zone techniques to try to advance the concerns about ensuring that we're protecting historic districts and historic properties, that we're protecting cultural assets and heritage at the same time and in the same context of driving additional housing supply. So if you go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through this at all. This is just a recent Pew study that's only about a month old that demonstrates broad public support across geographies and political orientation around these very specific kinds of reforms. So even though in any individual jurisdictions, these conversations get very controversial, that controversy doesn't necessarily represent the broad range of views about these sorts of changes. Doesn't always make it easy politically, but there is strong public support, which again, I think is one of the reasons that we see so much change. And when you dig a little bit deeper into that public support, you see a very sharp demographic divide. Younger people who feel very much shut out of housing opportunity in this country are really at the forefront of driving this change. If you go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the federal level. We are seeing an unprecedented level of federal interest in what has historically been the purview of localities almost exclusively, and that is all of these zoning and land use and housing related issues. And it's very bipartisan. If you go back to the Obama administration, through the Trump administration, and certainly now at an even higher level in the Biden administration, there has been this steady drumbeat at the federal level to evaluate exactly where the regulatory obstacles are to the provision of affordable housing and whether or not there are federal levers that can be used to drive some of that change. One new program that has emerged that I'll mention very quickly is HUD's Pro Housing Program, which is a new grant program aimed at localities to try to do the planning analysis and provide the capacity support for the regulatory reform, the changes in the zoning codes, the updates of housing plans and housing action plans. It's a new direction for federal involvement. It's clearly on the incentive side as opposed to the stick side, but it's an important new federal tool. It was funded for 1 year. It's up for renewal for a second year of funding. We certainly hope that that's the case. But we're seeing a steady drumbeat of other kinds of federal interventions aimed at promoting, incentivizing this sort of change that communities are focusing on in terms of overall zoning reform. Now, if you go to the next slide, I just want to start to close here by thinking a little bit about the critical role for preservation in all of the reform efforts that I was talking about. And I think, preservation is really critical for anyone who's focused on housing and housing supply at the local level. For the 4 C's there on the slide, there are real climate impacts to focusing on preserving and reusing existing building structure as opposed to just new construction. We know that the cost ultimately is less if we preserve existing affordable housing, if we preserve the fabric of housing that already exists while we're adding additional supply. So there's a cost element here. Certainly there's a cultural element as it relates to preserving the cultural assets of a community. And fourth, and I think this is something that we don't talk enough about, which is it's one way to reach consensus amidst what can be a very, very volatile and hostile conversation when it comes to making these sorts of changes at the local level. People have deep attachment to the existing fabric of their community. And so if there's a way to talk about ensuring that that is protected while we're also adding new density and new housing supply, that's a big part of the overall equation for ensuring there's broad public support for the changes. In terms of some thoughts about how preservationists can engage in this conversation in a productive way to be part of the coalition driving reform, one is, I think, to come at this squarely inside a pro-supply context. I think about this a lot in terms of how do we create processes that get us to yes, as opposed to many of the existing systems that seem designed to get us to no. Secondly, engaging in that planning process and being part of leading with planning and ensuring that these conversations are happening early on in the process is critically important. Third, and this I think is true for all of the advocates involved in the process, if we can focus on shared outcomes, I think it really helps us when we're debating the best way to get there. And then lastly, there are a lot of new tools that are important in helping the public understand and engage in making good decisions about what their community needs to look like, whether that's scenario tools or other ways to use technology to help people understand what the real choices are in front of them and what the real outcomes are that they want. So if you go to the next slide here, I just want to close by mentioning an initiative that we're involved with our colleagues at the National League of Cities called the Housing Supply Accelerator. This is an effort that also involves the National Association of Realtors, the Home Builders, and the Mortgage Bankers Association to really bring together the stakeholders across the full spectrum of housing production to identify those locally led solutions. We're going to be releasing a playbook in April, so I encourage you all to take a look at that. When it's released, I think there will be a lot of very specific ideas that will be valuable for your work at the local level. And then lastly, I'll just mention some APA resources that we have available, a series of policy guides on these topics that provide deep dive information. Our advocacy agenda is also available, very squarely focused on this topic. And then for those of you who are more involved in the professional practice side, a lot of resources that are more aimed at practitioners. And then we do have a new policy guide in development right now that's going to be focused on the role of historic preservation in the housing conversation. We're very excited about that. So thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate being here, and I will turn it over to Allie to talk a little bit about what some of this looks like on the ground.
Thank you so much. That was impressive. I want to quickly thank the National Trust for bringing me on board to speak on this panel discussion, and also to join these two powerhouse speakers. So very interesting topics. So hello, everyone. My name is Allison Toonen-Talamo. I'm an Associate 3 here at Klein and Hoffman, based in Chicago, Illinois. So hoping to provide a different light when it comes to housing and historic preservation as a building enclosure consultant and how we work with the team on a project. Next slide. So first off, I want to give you a little background about myself. I received my bachelor's in architecture and my master's in structural engineering at Illinois Institute of Technology here in Chicago. I've worked with my firm, Klein and Hoffman, for almost 9 years. And as a building enclosure consultant, restoration architect, we kind of have a lot of different titles over the years. But in practice, I've studied engineering and architecture, so I know both worlds. Within the firm specifically, I work on a handful of various tasks, performing proposal business development, performing historic research, hands-on investigation, working on construction documents. More or less from start to finish, I'm working on a project doing something. Our office has been pretty good at introducing us early on into different types of projects, different types of materials, so we've become well-rounded individuals in our profession. And what kind of gravitated to us, like what we like. So with me, I've learned that my calling was historic preservation, and I worked with a lot of buildings with regards to masonry, concrete coatings, and specifically cast iron is my thing. And then my quick tie into the National Trust is I was one of the recipients in 2022 for the American Express Award. Next slide. Next, I'm going to talk about my firm, Klein and Hoffman. We are a structural and architectural firm here in Chicago as our headquarters, and we also have a Philly and Milwaukee office. We have, in addition to our professionals, we have a lot of people that are licensed in various states, so we do travel as well to tend to our projects. Next slide. So with our firm, we do offer a wide range of services depending on the project and the client's needs. We primarily work only on existing buildings, whether they're vintage, landmarked, or more of a modern era of buildings. We also work on moving structures if they need to be moved for new development or being threatened for demolition. We also assist with additions, and we do work with a bigger team when it comes to altering buildings for a new purpose. One key thing to highlight specifically on the architectural team is we do provide services in regards to exterior, window, roofing components of the building. So we only really work on the exterior side, less on the interior. Next slide. So I want to present a couple of case studies or projects that we've actually worked on over the years. One of them is Rosenwald Courts on the south side of Chicago. The nice thing about this property is it's got a very, very rich history of tenants and how it's served the community over the years. It's always been a structure serving for housing, and it's kind of changed in program a little bit, but still in the tier of housing. So some of the most key tenants that you might recognize is, Nate Keene Cole, Duke Ellington, Jesse Owens, and Robert Taylor. So with that, we always want to make sure that we preserve the history and also the tenants and also the community understands who's lived in this space. You can go to the next slide. So sadly, over time, when it was constructed in 1929, the doors closed in 1999, and it stayed vacant for very many years. Around 2003, next slide, you could start seeing the movement of trying to protect the structure. It was listed on the National Registry, or it was listed on the National Trust Endangered Properties. And it was a big hunt to look for a new owner and trying to bring life to the community, as you see here. Next slide. Our office specifically served as a building enclosure consultant and structural engineer team assisting with the exterior facade, trying to match in kind with the materials that we have there. And then also trying to provide any oversight in regards to the construction and cost impact and schedule. Our structural team specifically reviewed the structural elements, design repairs, and if the design team was going to implement a new program into the building itself, we were there to oversee and provide assistance. And you could kind of see a photo in the middle where we had new brick and mortar being incorporated into the existing building. So we were very keen on trying to match as best as we can to the surrounding areas. And then you could kind of see the new development on the right-hand side earlier. And then here's a before and after photo of what it originally was to what it stands as now. Since the property was originally for housing related, the owner decided to keep the theme of housing present, but focus more on senior and family based systems. The rooms and square footage grew and provided more amenities for the tenants because that was something that was very important to the community, as well as providing area for additional commercial space along the storefront. Next slide. So next case study I'm going to show you guys is the Lawson House, also here in Chicago, but on the north side of the city. With this, it was built in 1931, originally utilized for affordable housing and primarily served for the community for different activities throughout the years. It does say 50 years, but it's actually been 90 plus years of serving as affordable housing. And then the switcheroo that they had in 2014 with the Holston development is they sold the property for $1 as long as they could extend the concept of housing for this building for 50 plus years, which they agreed to do. And again, our team specifically served as building enclosure consultants, removing fire escapes, helping the team implement a fireproof stairwell system and modifications to elevators, and trying to bring the facade to its grandeur as it used to be. Next slide. So I'm going to show you photos of the exterior, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the development of the property just to kind of give you guys the scale, the magnitude. So with the eliminating of the old housing approach for this property, Holston development team was very keen on trying to increase the square footage, the amenities that they originally had, like a pool system. They more or less kept that as a time capsule. In case someone were to purchase the building later down the road, they have it pretty much set in place. They would just have to remove the foam and the plexiglass system to kind of bring it back. They're paying homage to the Chicago Athletic Club here along North Michigan. You could go to the next slide. So they were very keen on it. Again, we're showing here a lot of the exterior work that was being done. We had a lot of damage to terracotta units, and then we were trying to restore them to back what it was. But on the interior side, Holston team utilized the fact that they had the existing windows there. They didn't change the sizing of the windows. They didn't change the construction. They kept it more or less to what it was. They used the window systems and the hallways to dictate what the floor system or the floor rooms patterns were going to be. And then also implemented efficient kitchens, bathrooms that were also accessible. So all the tenant spaces are accessible for anyone that would come to this property. The next slide. Kind of showing how much of decoration was to the exterior facade. We had a lot of issues with the supporting steel. So trying to restore all that to making sure it's buttoned up to last 50+ years. Next slide. And this is kind of the final product of the project in regards to the facade, what it looked like. Next slide. We managed to find a couple of postcards of what the rooms used to be. They were kind of dormitories, very tight spaces. They didn't have their own private bathrooms. They had a pool, they had a chapel, they had specialty rooms that were a log cabin, more of an Italianate style location. So it's a very unique building when it comes to how it was constructed. Holston did tell us that, some of the floor plates actually were like Swiss cheese because over the years, changing of the program, trying to accommodate more people, trying to fit more offices for the YMCA was something that was very, challenging over time. So they had to go back, pretty much start from fresh from the interior side and being able to accommodate and give these new tenants more dignity, more humane settings for living. So it's just kind of showing you guys how the turnout of it became. Next slide. So with that, that's kind of an example of some of the case studies that we've worked on this property. So thank you.
Well, Allie, thank you very much. That's it's always fun for preservationists to see the on-the-ground work and how some of the ideas captured from Chair Bronin and Jason Jordan can play out. So turning now to our discussion, there do seem to be a few questions resonating that we had that also seem to be resonating in the chat. So I'd like to start there and first go to Sara and then to Jason. And that is, we see hear the word increased density, and that can shake some nerves as to what that means in terms of demolition. Sara, ACHP's policy guidance encourages public serving institutions to explore innovative ideas like form-based codes to better balance housing creation and preserving historic buildings. I'm wondering if you might take a moment to just describe how the new policy guidance might help promote those opportunities, along with the concept of achieving density without demolition.
Sure. So within the policy statement, the key provision to look at is provision number 3, which is a bit of a list of potential tools that communities might use and people in those communities might advocate for to promote density without demolition. I mentioned a couple of them in my presentation: accessory dwelling units, allowing for compatible infill, removing minimum parking requirements. That one is, if you really dig into the history of zoning, it was something that was made up in the 1950s, 1960s, and included in zoning codes all over the country, and resulted in lots of historic buildings, including on main streets, being torn down. Many of those buildings did have housing mixed in as well. So minimum parking requirements is a big one. And maybe a little bit of an off the wall or rarely used idea, but transferable development rights, which could incentivize rehabilitations of historic buildings by allowing those property owners to sell the rights to build more densely in other parts of the city. And you mentioned form-based codes. The idea of the pattern books, the idea of design guidelines for new development, those kinds of ideas can be embedded in form-based codes and should be considered if what we want is compatible new development. But as preservationists, being involved in those conversations and proactively saying, "Oh no, we actually want this, and here's how we'd like to see it happen," is something that I think we should get more involved in, and something that our members through the policy statement voted to endorse.
Thank you. The creative approaches, I think, are all should be on the table. And with that, turning to you, Jason, and sticking with the zoning side, there are concepts in zoning like conservation districts, and you mentioned overlay zones, and we've seen recently research coming out of Los Angeles on historic preservation overlay zones and new thinking about what that might mean. How instead of a traditional thought where they might be just preserving historic fabric and architecture, expanding that concept to include preservation of affordable housing and diversity of different types of housing, which you mentioned as a key part of the solution, which we've seen have some success. That's what some of these districts have shown to demonstrate, is that they do a good job of preserving different housing types. But maybe you can speak to some of those innovations in the different either existing path zoning that could be refreshed and new thinking, or just new ideas altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just second what Sara said, that, I think there's a lot embedded in our existing structures that have actually had a pretty pernicious legacy when it comes to its impact on historic property. So this is a refreshing conversation to be able to go back and look at things like parking requirements. But as it relates to things like overlay zones, conservation districts, heritage districts, I think the key thing here, there are a lot of different tools, and I would point folks to a recent report that we did just last month as part of our zoning practice resource that's on using those tools for the preservation of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is an approach that a lot of communities are taking, particularly when there are severe development pressures, where there's a lot of interest in larger scale, new multifamily construction, other kinds of luxury property development. How do we protect? So there's a lot of work being done there, and I would point you to that resource for a lot of very specific examples. I will say generally, though, one of the concepts that I think is most important here is the degree of intentionality behind these things, like thinking very hard about what it is we want to preserve, what stories need to be preserved in those communities, and how can that be reflected in a more modernized approach to our regulatory structure. I think that's where it starts. And honestly, if we can get the planning process out of becoming the zoning police and back into the business of helping residents and communities think about what it is that they want, what the vision is, then we can have better conversations about the rules that we need to have in place that allow us to get just that. Right? The kinds of forms that we want to see more of in our communities, the kinds of forms that need to be protected, and how we provide housing opportunity for everybody, as opposed to trying to come up with one-size-fits-all standards that have created, unfortunately, a lot of bureaucratic layers that aren't really serving any of us very well, including preservation advocates. So this is an opportunity, I think, to rethink some of those things without necessarily throwing all of the tools that we have away. I'm not an abolitionist by any means here. I do think getting the conversation around to things like form-based codes and more flexible and adaptable approaches can be really helpful in achieving the goals I think we all share here.
That's great. And Jason, there was a question about the name of the report you referenced. So if you don't mind plugging that into the chat, I think folks would be interested to see that. Allie, over to you, and just interested in your thoughts. We touched a few times on the notion of office conversions, and you mentioned different materials, and we're coming up on the mid-1970s as being 50 years old, and a lot new materials to be thinking about, and perhaps you can speak to both opportunities and challenges of some of the new materials that are coming online in that 50-year span, and also just any quick reaction that you might have to the office conversion, and just some of the broad contours of the challenges and opportunities that presents.
Yeah, of course. So within our team, we have seen a handful of buildings that have been converted from former office buildings or warehouses into residential. But a lot of times we do see that in more of a condo setting than affordable housing. But it's happening. We do see a very big interest coming in. The prior mayor that we have here in Chicago, she implemented like the LaSalle corridor. So that was, putting funding to support office buildings that are pretty much left vacant or can't really support themselves, and bringing in housing and commercial space to kind of bring a new life to downtown area. It's kind of a slow moving target at this point, but the city hasn't given up with that idea. And I do appreciate that. And I hope it does go forward, because it will present a different topography in building stock and viewpoints. Very similar to what was discussed early in the conversations. A lot of people do have that fear of like, oh, it's an office building, it can't become a home for anyone. And that's not true. You just need a good team. You need a good developer. You need a good owner that knows how to be smart when it comes to finances, and also keeping that vision moving forward. Because we do see a lot of people that might just get scared off because they can't financially drive that project. And that's, if they just utilize the resources and tools, it is doable. And again, this is kind of like out of my wheelhouse, but I do see that happening. I do see that pressure. I do see the appreciation, very similar to Holston Development, working on the Lawson House. Like, they weren't afraid. They just went full force and did whatever they could to bring the structure up to what it needed to be and to serve the community better. Now, going into the concept of, more modern structures and how they age out, that's a little bit of a different conversation, because at least with our position as an engineer and architect that we've seen as a forensic, we study materials. We know how materials fail in the city sense and the climates that we deal with. 1950s is probably when we started seeing people playing around or exploring how materials can work. So that's why we see an influx on material failure, like condensation. If you do a full glass, Florida glass ceiling window system, the energy performance is not there. It's just trying to retrofit new materials into what we have. So it's just a slight different approach, especially with more modern structures. They build things quick and they build things fast. So we do see that problem when we have to go into, trying to mitigate water infiltration or trying to restore something, or, just basic upkeeping on the building. It's a slightly different story, but luckily in the industry, we see people testing the material, trying to find other ways that are means and methods that it's more appropriate for long-term repairs, and just working with boards and owners to understand what they want at the end of the day to be better stewards to their buildings.
As we saw in the comments, repurpose is taking on a whole new meaning, and we're just at the top of the hour, so I wanted to cover 3 final slides. But thank you to the panel today, and the focus on local customized solutions, and I think that will be really an innovative thing that we will look to at the national level for an important way forward. Thank you to the panel. This has been really, we could go for another hour, I'm sure, with the expertise and talent on the panel. So thank you. I did want to flag a few upcoming webinars for the Preservation Forum members. We have a book talk for a new book, Dwell Time, with author Rosa Lowinger. That is on March 21st at 3 p.m. Please be sure to check that out. And if you're not a forum member, sign up to participate in that. Next slide, please. And be sure to check out our Pass Forward online symposium. This is following our conference, and that'll take place in April, April 3rd and 4th. And this is going to feature speakers on mitigate and adapting to the changing climate. So that'll be a really exciting section that we hope you all will come back for. And finally, final slide, contact information, savingplaces.org, Preservation Leadership Forum. And to connect to our webinars, please visit savingplaces.com, upcoming webinars. Thank you everyone for joining and for staying an extra couple minutes. And please, again, in the chat, let's thank this great panel for all the important work they're doing and the inspiring leadership for preservation and for affordable housing. Thank you everybody for joining. Appreciate you tuning in.